Hello and welcome to the C++11 Beginner Tutorials by Gamer2Creator. I'm Chris. So now that we have methods under our belt, we're going to talk about a special kind of method. It's called the constructor. Now, in our code before, we were doing stuff like this. Here we create our player instance called a user. Our variable now contains an x and a y float, which we assign each to 100. Then we come down here and we call the method move.x on our user, and we send it 50. We do the same for y, and then we print out our new values. This is how we were writing code. This is getting pretty good. We're almost where we want to be. Constructors will allow us to replace this code with the constructor code that will allow us to initialize our values in an object-oriented fashion. So we've been actually using a constructor here. We just didn't write it. It's a default empty constructor. C++ does this automatically. Once we write our own constructor, the default constructor will disappear and only our constructor will remain. However, the copy constructor will still exist. So let's go ahead and do this now. We're going to make our player class take in two floats. Since that's what we have as our fields, that's our data. We have an x and y floats. And instead of assigning them like this, we're going to use a constructor. The syntax for a constructor that is empty looks like this. As you can see, the name of the method is the same as the class, but there is no return type, not even void. In between the parentheses, we can have a list of parameters. And here we can do some code. We can also use our parameters to assign some default values. So we're going to use a float xx, float yy. Then we're going to assign xx to our x. And now we have ourselves a constructor. As you can see, we've made this constructor so that it has two floats, which matches our fields. You don't have to do it like that. In fact, you can do it any way you want. You could have a string here. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. Let's give our player a string. This is going to be the player's name. Up here, we're going to take in a string, and we're going to call it name. And we're going to assign him name, or member name, to name. And as you see, we have changed our constructor. Now, we've already covered overloading, and we can overload these if we wish. For example, we could make a player that doesn't take in a string name, and just a float xx and float yy. And we'll assign him name to equal an empty space x equals xx and y equals yy. So as you can see, we can make more than one overloaded constructor. Now right here on the right of our variable name, we can put our first parentheses, and we can, in IntelliSense, look at all of the constructors that are available to us. That's the copy constructor, is the default copy constructor. We did not have to write that. There's the one that takes in a string name, and then there's one that just takes in two floats. We're going to give it a name. Leroy. We'll say 1.0 and 1.0. And there we've called our constructor. As you can see, the constructor will construct our user object and set its default x and y to what we passed in. And we can delete this code. Now we've initialized our object using the constructor. And the rest of our code should work. When we move x and y to 50, we should end up at 51. And there we go. Let's go ahead and print out user.mName just to prove that that's working. There we go. And then let's call through overloading the other constructor. And as you can see, an empty space is there. So there we have a constructor. Now you can also call this constructor like this. However, this will create a temporary right here, and then call the copy constructor, copy the value of this temporary into our user. So it can be more efficient to do this. Now maybe a compiler will optimize it out, maybe not. So I recommend that you write your constructors like this. Now let's do this for the employee class. Let's delete all our code. We're going to come up here and make some constructors. Now because we know that we're going to want to be able to create our employee from a console after it's been constructed, then having an empty constructor that assigns default values to our employee fields is going to be handy. And I will explain and show you why in a moment. Now the string classes will be constructed using their own constructor automatically, but we're going to go ahead and do it explicitly just so that it's clear. Actually, it should be 0 and M salary equals 0. So as you can see, we set it up to be basically valid. These have 0 in them, so they're not junk. But really, it's empty. It's valid, but empty. Now, the other constructor that we might need access to is one that actually takes in a string first name, a string last name, and int age and int salary. So this gives us the option through overloading whether we want to just set some default values really quick and then later get it from the console, or if we have the data already, we can just send it into the constructor and everything will be set up. As you can see here, whenever I say image equals age, you can see why I didn't just call the employee's field age without the m, because now we have two differently named variables. If, for example, the field was age, then we would have two variables that are the same name. So I just wanted to point that out. So we get some pretty good code here. Now, we have our two options for constructing our employee. We're going to call this one emp1, and we're just going to put a semicolon there. This is going to call the constructor with just the empty parentheses. You cannot call an empty constructor like this. And this is kind of a quirk of C++, but this is actually declaring a function call. As you can see, it turned red, just like this. This is red because it's a function. It's been declared and defined, and this is declaring a function that returns an employee called emp1. So if you don't have any parameters in your constructor, don't put a parentheses. If you do have parameters, then you can put the parentheses and then your parameters. So here, then we're going to do emp1 dot get from console. So as you can see, we've constructed our object with no parameters and just made it empty but valid, and then got our information from the console. In the second example, we're going to call the other employee constructor. We're just going to call this em2. But this time we're going to call the constructor with all of its parameters, and we're going to say you really chickens. $20. So we've sent in this for the first name, the last name, the age, and his wage or salary. And we've instead constructed this object with values and data that we already had, instead of waiting to get them from console. So as you can see, using overloading, we've done two different kinds of constructing. Now we're going to run through this once in the debugger so that you can see just how this will play out. So we're going to stop it on the first line. As you can see, we have weird junk values in here. None of this has actually been assigned to anything. So we step into we ended up going right over it. Let's try this again. Step into, step out, step into, step out. It's going right over our constructor, but it's being called. As you can see by the values, we have 0 and 0. And our strings are empty. And that's what we told it to do right here. And we go down here. Well, I'm going to enter wishful thinking. Now that we're here, it's going to construct a string, I think, first. And then another one. And now we're in our employee constructor. And this is the one with the first, the last strings, the age, and the salary. And if we look under this, we can see we have junk values here in age and salary. These just were whatever happened to be in that memory at that time. As we step over, we can see first for some reason it's not showing up correctly in the debugger. But as you can see, it has worked correctly. Imp2, first name Leroy, last name Jenkins, age 13, salary 20. So we have our two constructors here.